College football fans, we have made it to week 9 of the 2022 college football season. And this is the final week before we deal with the College Football Playoff Committee rankings, which only means one thing. We are heading towards the month of November. And the month of November is always a big month in college football. It is crunch time. There are teams that are looking to hang on to their top 4 spot in the rankings. There are teams that are looking to get themselves into the top 4, try to be one of those last 4 remaining. And there are teams that are just looking to finish strong going into next season. Teams that have nothing to lose but a lot to gain. And playing a team that has nothing to lose but a lot to gain in the month of November is a dangerous team to play. And this November, I think, is going to be like no other. We have Georgia and Tennessee squaring off against each other next week. Ohio State and Michigan face off against each other, and both of them are going to potentially be undefeated going into that game. So there is a lot to still be decided in the 2022 college football season. Johnny Talk Sports, here to bring you my Week 9 college football predictions. So without further ado, let's get into the Week 9 college football predictions. Game number 1 on the docket this week, number 17, Illinois and Nebraska, and I have a vested interest in this game. Illinois is in a strong position to be playing for the Big Ten championship, while Nebraska, not only this game on Saturday, but the final 5 games of the year, potential career-changing 5 weeks for interim head coach Mickey Joseph. Because if Mickey Joseph, if he can do what Scott Frost failed to do in his entire tenure at Nebraska and take the Huskers to a bowl game, I think there is almost no choice but to make Mickey Joseph the permanent head coach. And I think that a lot of the players really want Mickey Joseph as the head coach. Ever since he was named the interim coach, I've noticed a much different vibe, and a lot of people around Nebraska have noticed a different vibe and a different attitude with this Huskers team. They are more accountable and they're more disciplined. 2 things that went unnoticed in the Scott Frost tenure. But who really knows what's going on with the head coaching situation at Nebraska? Although I think that a complete wild card candidate would be Illinois head coach Brett Bielema. And I have never been so interested in pre-game interactions or even post-game interactions. I'm going to keep my eye out for the body language that these 2 gentlemen possess for each other before and after the game. Because Trev Alberts made it very clear that he is going after somebody that has a name and has an identity to college football. Does Brett Bielema necessarily fit that type of resume? Maybe not necessarily, but Brett Bielema did really well at Wisconsin. Wisconsin was a very strong competitor with Brett Bielema, and you could say that they were up until this season, winning 9-10 games a year. But Brett Bielema does really well at the Big Ten. As you can see, he has Illinois, the 17th ranked team in the country, in only his 2nd season. And Illinois is leading the FBS in scoring defense and total defense. They have the leading rusher in Chase Brown at running back, and they are 2nd in the country in run defense. For Nebraska, they are 115th in run defense. They have had a hard time stopping the run all season long. Anthony Grant is 5th in the Big Ten in rushing yards. Well, rushing yards per game, I should say. 97.5 rushing yards per game. For Nebraska to win this game, they have got to get Anthony Grant going. Casey Thompson has been really cold in his last 3 games. 5 interceptions to only 6 touchdown passes. But the bright spot for Nebraska at this point, LSU transfer Trey Palmer, 6th in the FBS in receiving yards at 781. In fact, he was leading the nation in receiving yards last week. Now, this is a 2:30 Central Time kickoff. But if this was a primetime game, I would pick Nebraska to pull off the upset. But since this is a day game and it's not as intimidating as it would be under the lights, I think Illinois wins this game, but I don't think it's going to be by that much. As much as Nebraska's had a hard time stopping the run, I think they're going to do a much better job compared to what they've done throughout the year. I think Illinois wins this game 23-21. So I do think Nebraska is going to cover in this game. But I think the Illini win it at the very end. But this is an opportunity, a golden opportunity for Mickey Joseph to pick up an upset win. Something that Scott Frost was never able to do. He wasn't able to get those big upset victories. Even Mike Riley beat Michigan State and really gave them a roadblock to making the college football playoff that year. So I'm going Illini. Moving on to a Pac-12 battle, Stanford goes on the road to take on number 12 UCLA, and Stanford may be 3-4. But their 4 losses are USC, Oregon, Oregon State, and Washington. You can't really knock them for losing to USC and Oregon. Those are 2 top 10 teams in the entire country. Oregon State, they were the better team for most of the game, but they gave it up at the very end. And Washington, well, before Washington faced off against UCLA, they looked like serious Pac-12 contenders. So Stanford has won their last 2 games in a row, and their defense has only allowed 14 points in each of those 2 games. And I mainly want to talk about Stanford right now because David Shaw, I don't even know if he's on the hot seat or not, but if he isn't, he needs to be. Because David Shaw is in the top 5 as far as paid coaches in college football. And this is what he's produced. Stanford hasn't been relevant since the Christian McCaffrey days. And I get your argument if you're going to say, well, Jimbo Fisher also has A&M at 3-4. All right, I get the argument. And if I was talking about A&M this week, I'd be getting into Jimbo Fisher as well. But I'm not. David Shaw, I think, if he wins this game, pulls off the massive upset as they are almost 17-point underdogs, then that's going to silence those hot seat conversations. And the hot seat conversations, they've really been taking place behind closed doors. They're not really public. But Stanford is 93rd in total defense. So the Stanford defense in the last couple of weeks, they have bent, but they haven't broken. While UCLA, despite losing to Oregon, suffering their first loss of the year, Dorian Thompson-Robinson and Zach Charbonnet still had a good performance. Dorian Thompson-Robinson had 262 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 pick. And Zach Charbonnet, 20 carries, 151 yards, and a touchdown last week. And ultimately, that was just one of those deals where Oregon was just the better team on Saturday. I mean, Dorian Thompson-Robinson came out and said that if the team would have done their job and did what they're supposed to do, they would have won that game. And there's still a possibility that they could see Oregon again in the Pac-12 championship. And this UCLA team, 14th in scoring offense and 10th in total offense. So I don't know how long this Stanford defense is going to be able to keep Stanford in this game. I think UCLA wins this one by a long shot. I think that they at least cover the 16.5. But sometimes you just never know in college football. This season in particular has been a wild one. Moving on to Notre Dame and number 16 Syracuse. Now Notre Dame is a strong candidate for biggest disappointment of the 2022 college football season. Despite that, I think they have a really good chance of pulling off the upset here, as I am not sure how Syracuse is going to come out in this game, as they took Clemson to the wire last week. In fact, they had an 11-point lead on Clemson going into the fourth quarter, but Clemson came back and won the game, partly because Clemson's defense, they kept them in the game. As Syracuse, they played as perfect of a football game as you possibly could to upset Clemson. But Clemson's defense, they held their own. They didn't allow the game to get out of reach, just enough for Clemson to come back with backup quarterback Cade Klubnik, and Clemson survived that one. Survived in advance. As Syracuse defense, they forced turnovers against Clemson. And a turnover late, that sealed the game. Now, I think that Notre Dame wins this game because last week is definitely still on Syracuse's mind. They're thinking the what ifs. If Dino Babers can get the team dialed in and focused, then Syracuse should have no problem. But Notre Dame, they have nothing to lose right now. All Notre Dame can do is just win games and have some sort of positive end to their season. And I think that starts here with an upset victory over Syracuse. Even though Syracuse has the 6th best scoring defense in college football and the 16th best total defense, I just think that Notre Dame, this is a team that's not going to give up. As people don't talk about Marcus Freeman that much right now since Notre Dame is struggling, but he is a disciplined guy, and there was a reason why they upgraded him to head coach. And Notre Dame's defense is good. They're a top 30 defense statistically in the country. And they held one of the best offenses, in fact, the second best scoring offense in college football in Ohio State, to just 21 points. So this Notre Dame team, despite what their season's been so far, they're no slouch, and they'll pull off the upset. Moving on to Florida and number 1 Georgia. The good news for Florida is this is a rivalry game. And when you have rivalry games, records and stats and numbers and history gets tossed out the window. It's this game and this game only. While Florida, after week 1, I admit this every time I talk Florida on here, I thought they had the potential of being a New Year's 6 candidate. And then the next week lose to Kentucky. They lose to Tennessee, which, with how Tennessee's been doing since, you can't knock them for that. But Florida has a chance to play spoiler to one of their biggest rivals. And as I said in the beginning, the later you get into the season, the more challenging these games get no matter who you're playing. Because teams have nothing to lose. They can only play spoiler and finish the year strong. And that's what Florida, that's what they're doing at this point. Now, if Florida's going to pull off the monumental upset, as they are 22.5-point underdogs right now, the Anthony Richardson of week 1 that ran all over Utah's defense needs to emerge. And Anthony Richardson has been pretty much non-existent since week 1. And even if he shows up, even if the week when Anthony Richardson comes out to play, Georgia's second in the country in total offense. And they have the fourth best total defense in college football, second in scoring defense. So, despite Georgia losing a lot of key players on defense from last year's championship team, this defense is still good, and it's still one of the strongest ones, if not maybe the strongest in all of college football. So I think Georgia just wins this game pretty handily. Although another thing going for Florida is, Georgia plays Tennessee next week, so they could be looking ahead to that. And sometimes when that happens, they take their opponent the week before that pretty lightly. But Kirby Smart's disciplined. He's going to get his guys disciplined, and Georgia's going to win this game by at least 30, although I also thought Georgia's going to beat Missouri by 45 plus. But, yeah, if Florida can just stay in the game, then there's a chance. But I don't think they can stay in this game longer than about 3-4 minutes. But this season has been filled with surprises. Moving on to number 9 Oklahoma State and number 22 Kansas State. And something I find really interesting about this matchup is Kansas State is favored by 1.5. This is the third game in a row Oklahoma State are underdogs, including their fourth in their last 5 games. So now 4 of the last 5 games, Oklahoma State has been an underdog, which is something that you don't see at all when you're thinking of a top 10 team in the country. But that is Oklahoma State. For Kansas State, I'm wondering who the quarterback is going to be in this game. Is it going to be Adrian Martinez, who left the game really early against TCU last week with what appeared to be a hip injury? Will it be Will Howard, the backup, who excelled in the early portion of the game? In fact, he was the big reason why Kansas State jumped out to a 20-10 lead early on in that game. Or will they be down to third-string quarterback Jake Rubley, who had to come in temporarily as Will Howard's getting looked at for what appeared to be a shoulder injury? Now, whoever the quarterback is, they will be reliant on Deuce Vaughn, as Kansas State is 11th in the country in run defense. Well, Oklahoma State, they are 4th in scoring offense, and I did say that last week that Kansas State was going to pull off the ups against TCU. It was looking like that, despite them completely going off script of what they're used to, which they honestly had to because Will Howard was a quarterback, and he is the much better passer than Adrian Martinez. But, injuries are something that is a part of football, but TCU came back and beat Kansas State. And I still think the same thing applies. Despite Oklahoma State being a top scoring offense, the teams that you don't like to face are the teams that run the football and teams that run the football efficiently. But despite that, Oklahoma State, they have just been resilient this entire season so far. Even though they have the double overtime loss to TCU, they've been resilient in these last few weeks. Being underdogs, they come out and play. And this is an upset pick here, but I'm picking Oklahoma State to pull off the upset. Although 1.5, not really that big of an upset, but it'll probably go down to a pick 'em by the end of the week, depending on what the news is as far as the Kansas State quarterback situation is concerned. Number 19, Kentucky, and number 3, Tennessee. Right now, the Volunteers sit as a 12.5-point favorite, with the best scoring offense in college football, averaging just over 50 points per game, and the best total offense in the FBS, averaging 571.7 yards per game. So with those two factors in mind, and they also have a Heisman contender in Hendon Hooker at quarterback, and a star receiver in Jalen Hyatt, how does Kentucky give themselves a chance in this game? Well, by starters, their defense. They rank 14th in total defense in the FBS. Their scoring defense is 9th, giving up an average of only 16.43 points per game. And their running game as well. Can their running game move the football efficiently to slow down the pace of the game? As Kentucky, they've done that throughout the entire season, as the Wildcats are 7th in time of possession. So if Kentucky can dictate the pace of this game, then there's a chance. But quarterback Will Levis has to play perfect football. He can't turn the football over. Kentucky as a whole just can't turn the ball over because Tennessee can and will make you pay for it very fast and swiftly. With that being in mind, I think Tennessee wins this game pretty handily. In fact, I honestly think that Tennessee could spot Kentucky 14 points to start the game, and I think they'd still cover. I think that's how dynamic and efficient this Tennessee offense is. And assuming Georgia and Tennessee can both take care of business, a top 3, maybe even a 1 versus 2 showdown next week, depending on how the committee feels. Or if Penn State somehow beats Ohio State, which we are going to get into right now. Wrapping up the Week 9 college football predictions with the game of the week, number 2 Ohio State travels to Happy Valley to take on the 16th ranked Penn State Nittany Lions. Now when I look at this game, the first thing I saw was the line. Ohio State as a 15.5 point favorite. And I was curious to what the line would be in this one because I've seen a lot of slander on social media about how Ohio State is yet to play a real team. The only team that they've played with a winning record at this point in the year is Toledo. Well, it shouldn't matter what the records of the opponents are because you can't knock Ohio State for beating bad opponents that they face. The only thing that matters is they're winning these games. As Ohio State has had a history of not playing well against bad opponents, getting blown out by 20, 30 against bad opponents. And their defense, which was a big question mark coming into the year, as their defense was something that was of concern all of last year. 5th in scoring defense. The Ohio State offense, 2nd scoring offense, only behind Tennessee, averaging 49.5 points per game. 4th in total offense. 47 total touchdowns this season, which is the most in college football. And when I look at Ohio State, they have, I think, the most complete team in the country. Heisman favorite C.J. Stroud. You got a really strong running game that even though they weren't utilized as much against Iowa last week, they are starting to emerge. And they're starting to get recognition. I'd say Ohio State has the best receiving core in all of college football. Jackson Smith-Njigba is back in the lineup, although he hasn't been utilized as much, which is okay, considering he missed time with an injury that he suffered in the opener against Notre Dame. But when Jackson Smith-Njigba gets going again, it's going to be tough to stop this Ohio State offense. It's going to be tougher than it already is. While Penn State, on the other hand, they have allowed 418 rushing yards against Michigan a couple weeks ago, and last week 102 rush yards against Minnesota, which that's a pretty good number considering Minnesota always runs the football. Well, they gave up 102 rushing yards to Mo Ibrahim, I should add. As far as total rushing yards, whatever it was a pretty good number considering Minnesota just runs the football constantly. For Penn State to win this game, to give them a chance, they have got to score early in this game, get the crowd into it. I mean, Honestly, as much as Ohio State is my national champion pick, I think that Ohio State's kind of lucky here that it's not a night game, that it's not the whiteout game. Because if it was the whiteout game, then Penn State's crowd would be on their feet the entire game. They'd be into it all night long, and there'd be a stronger chance for them. But since this is a noon Eastern kickoff because of Big Ten kickoff ruining everything, and Fox Sports ruining everything, for Penn State to give themselves a chance, play like they did in the first half against Michigan and the first offensive possession in the second half. Because Penn State had a lead against Michigan, 17-16, but then Michigan just dominated the rest of the way. With Ohio State's running game starting to emerge, and Penn State having a hard time stopping the run against Michigan a couple weeks ago, I just don't know what kind of chance there is for the Nittany Lions, so I'm going to go with Ohio State to win this game. But as far as covering the spread, I could probably see Penn State covering, but that's about it. I can't see him winning this outright, so I am picking the Buckeyes, but a questionable cover at this point. If I had to guess, I think Ohio State, I'd say they'd cover, but probably not by too much, not overwhelmingly. So that will do it for my Week 9 college football predictions. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. And as always, have a good day and enjoy your college football Saturday. Let's hope that Georgia and Tennessee take care of business. So next week, we can talk about the game of the season, Tennessee and Georgia. Take care.